Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating framework for reading ancient texts, pulled straight from a source document called Tzohar the Way. We're going to do something a bit radical today. We're going to completely set aside our pre-approved biases, our conventional wisdom, and those comfortable historical assumptions we all carry around, to uncover mysteries that might literally be hiding in plain sight. It's an incredible journey that really challenges how we look at history, language, and the ancient texts that have profoundly shaped our world. To kick things off, let's look at this striking thought from Solomon, who is traditionally considered the wisest man who ever lived. Wise men and women are always learning, always listening for fresh insights. The source text uses this to point out something absolutely crucial. Wisdom isn't a destination, it's a posture. The exact moment you decide you already know all the answers, well, you've stopped being wise. And that perfectly sets the stage for the investigative journey we're taking today.
Section 1. The Posture of Wisdom. Let's just jump right into the author's core investigative method here.
To truly understand these texts, the author argues that we have to adopt a literal, almost childlike perception. And this brilliantly illustrates the premise. If you ask anyone who grew up reading these texts how many tribes of Israel there are, they'll immediately tell you 12, right? It's the standard passed-down consensus. But while conventional wisdom confidently counts 12, a careful literal reading of the text actually enumerates 13. Because when you look closely, without your preconceived filters, the tribal groups of Ephraim and Manasseh are actually counted separately in multiple passages. We so often just defer to the traditional answer instead of counting for ourselves. So the author asks a pretty heavy question. If we've been glossing over something that incredibly simple, what else are we missing?
Exhibit A, the Anomaly of Jonah. Let's see how this literal reading approach builds as we re-examine the famous story of Jonah descending into the deep.
You likely know the basics, right? Jonah is swallowed by a giant creature, spends 3 days inside, gets returned to dry land. The traditional interpretation just calls it a biological miracle and moves right along. But let's look at it with that literal, childlike posture. In Jonah chapter 2, we actually get a first-hand description of his descent, and listen to his highly specific observations. He describes sinking down to the literal roots of the mountains. He notes the deep currents swirling around him. He even specifically mentions seaweed wrapping around his head. Now, the traditional interpretation brushes this off as psalmic language, just conventional poetic imagery to describe a near-death experience. But the author posits that we should read it literally, as highly specific spatial and physical observations. Because think about it, seaweed wrapping around a head is a very concrete sensory detail for a purely poetic metaphor, isn't it?
This brings us to a massive visibility problem. How on earth could Jonah observe seaweed and underwater mountain ranges while stuck inside the pitch-black stomach of a biological creature? Seriously, a man inside a biological stomach is in complete, utter darkness. He can't see the ocean floor, he definitely can't watch seaweed wrap around his head if he is entirely unexposed to the water around him.
This exact visibility issue leads the text to ask us to consider a paradigm-shifting hypothesis. What if Jonah was actually inside a craft with a transparent observation area? Basically what modern researchers would call a USO, or an unidentified submersible object. If he was in an environment where he could actually see his surroundings during his descent to extreme depths, well, those highly specific details of his account suddenly make literal, logical sense.
Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter so much? Well, it's because Jesus specifically staked his entire proof of identity on the historical, physical sign of Jonah. When the religious authorities of the day demanded a sign, he didn't offer them a magic trick. He pointed to a man who descended into the deep and survived. This literal framework might completely explain why he did that. Because if Jonah was just a poetic allegory, then the sign is built on fiction. But if Jonah experienced something structurally real, a literal descent inside something that could sustain him and that he could observe from, it completely changes the nature of the sign being offered to us.
Exhibit B, Anatomy of a Leviathan. Now we're going to raise the stakes a bit as we examine this fearsome and mysterious creature known as Leviathan.
The author shows us that this whole theory is deeply rooted in linguistic precision. You see, English translations often mistakenly flatten ancient sea creatures into a single generic sea monster category, but the original Hebrew breaks it down into 3 entirely distinct terms. You have Dag Gadol, which means great fish. That's the word used for whatever swallowed Jonah. Then you have Tenin, which means sea monster or serpent. And finally, there is Leviathan or Leviathan, which is an entirely different word used in Job, Psalms, and Isaiah. The ancient text is making distinctions that actually matter, and we really need to pay attention to them.
And just look at how Psalm 104 describes this entity. Leviathan isn't presented as some defeated chaos monster that's barely contained by the divine. Rather, it's described as a deliberate feature of the created order that God designed to delightfully frolic in the waters. It's a purposeful entity whose existence is actually celebrated.
But it's Job chapter 41 that really demands our literal reading. I mean, check out these mechanical traits. Rows of tightly sealed shields where no air can pass, smoke pouring from its nostrils like a boiling pot, complete immunity to iron and bronze weapons like they literally bounce right off, and it leaves a glowing, luminescent wake behind it in the deep. Again, if we read this without assuming it's just a fairy tale, this reads much more like an advanced engineering blueprint than a biological beast. What biological animal has tightly sealed outer shields that repel metal and leaves a glowing wake in the ocean? The description is startlingly mechanistic.
Exhibit C, a NASA engineer's revelation. For our final exhibit, the source material grounds this literal reading theory in a modern, scientific reality.
It's one thing for us to sit here and reread ancient texts, but what happens when a literal rocket scientist looks at them? The text introduces us to Joseph Blumrich. And Blumrich wasn't just any guy with a calculator, he was a highly credentialed NASA engineer. He was the chief of the Systems Layout Branch in NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. We're talking about a guy who literally helped build the Saturn V rockets that took human beings to the moon, not to mention the Skylab space station. He knew aerospace engineering inside and out.
So back in the 1970s, Blumrich set out to read the prophet Ezekiel's famous vision. Ezekiel describes this wild scene: a windstorm coming out of the north, a center of fire like glowing metal, wheels intersecting wheels that can move in any direction, and high rims full of what look like eyes. Now, Blumrich read this for the express purpose of debunking the popular ancient astronaut theories of the time. He wanted to use his aerospace background to prove that whatever Ezekiel saw, it would fail basic engineering principles and couldn't possibly be a functional craft.
But man, he was in for the surprise of his professional life. To his immense shock, by applying his aerospace background to a careful, literal reading of the ancient text, he accidentally proved to himself that the engineering described was entirely functional. The conventional interpretation treats Ezekiel's account as a highly symbolic throne vision full of dramatic imagery. But Blumrich found the descriptions of the glowing metal, the rotors, and those intersecting wheels to be so mechanically sound that he actually patented a design for an omnidirectional wheel based directly on Ezekiel's ancient text. Absolutely wild.
Which leaves us with a profound final thought for this explainer. The author is really challenging us to reclaim our literal reading comprehension. If a child can count 13 tribes while scholars just repeat 12, and a literal NASA engineer can find patented aerospace mechanics in a prophet's vision, what else might be hiding in plain sight if we just have the courage to read with the eyes of a child?